14 July, 1789, a date etched into the memory of mankind. On that morning, the Bastille medieval fortress turned prison and hated symbol of royal oppression stood as it had for centuries. Gray, impenetrable, eternal. By evening, it was nothing but smoldering rubble, its stones torn apart by the bare hands of enraged Parisians. How could a single day, a single act, set ablaze an entire order that had endured for centuries? What chain of injustice, arrogance, and desperation had brought France, the jewel of Europe, to this cataclysmic breaking point? And, perhaps more hauntingly, did those who stormed the Bastille truly understand what forces they had unleashed? Today, more than 2 centuries later, we still live in the shadow of that revolution. A world shaped by its promises and its betrayals. The France of 1789 was a paradox. It was at once the richest and most admired kingdom in Europe and the most fragile, a land of dazzling salons, opule palaces, and courtly dances built on the backs of peasants crushed by taxes and starvation. The old regime, ancient regime, had endured countless wars, plagues, and intrigues, yet it was a system rotting from within. The King Louis XVI was a man of good intentions, but weak will a monarch more interested in locks and hunting than in grappling with the storms gathering over his realm. His queen, Marie Antoinette, became a hated symbol of decadence, caricatured as the foreign-born Austrian woman who callously suggested, "Let them eat cake." When told of the people's hunger, France's social structure was a powder keg. The first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility, held privilege beyond imagining. They owned vast lands, paid little to no taxes, and wielded enormous influence at court. Meanwhile, the third estate, the commoners, made up 98% of the population, burdened with crushing taxes, feudal due, forced labor, and now, famine. In this climate of misery, Enlightenment ideas found fertile ground. Rousseau's social contract, Voltaire's searing critiques of absolutism, Montesquieu's visions of balanced governance, these were no longer just theories discussed in cafes. They had become a call to arms. When Louis, desperate to address the financial ruin brought on by war debts and fiscal mismanagement, summoned the Estates General in May of 1789, the first such meeting in 175 years, she hoped for new taxes. What he got instead was revolution. In June, frustrated by endless debates and the stonewalling of the privileged classes, the deputies of the Third Estate broke away. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the French nation. Barred from their usual meeting place, they gathered instead at a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they swore an oath, "We shall not separate, and we shall reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the kingdom is established." It was a declaration that the king no longer stood above the law. The oath sent shockwaves through France, and it set in motion a dramatic chain of events. The fall of the Bastille, the great fear sweeping the countryside, the storming of aristocratic estates, the night of August 4th when the Assembly abolished feudal privileges, and the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. But for all its lofty ideals, the revolution was entering treacherous waters. At first, many revolutionaries believed France could become a constitutional monarchy modeled after Britain, where the king reigned but did not rule. But Louis, under pressure from conservative courtiers and his queen, plotted to escape. In June 1791, he and his family fled Paris under cover of night, aiming for the loyalist stronghold at Montmedy. But at Varennes, they were recognized, arrested. The king's betrayal shattered the fragile trust between crown and people. From that moment, the monarchy's days were numbered. By 1792, France was engulfed by multiple crises: economic collapse, food shortages, political factionalism, and the looming threat of foreign invasion. Austria and Prussia, fearful of revolution spreading to their own lands, declared that the king's safety was their common concern. The French saw this as a declaration of war in all but name, and on April 20th, 1792, they acted, declaring war on Austria. The gamble would unleash a maelstrom no one could control. The French armies, once among the most formidable in Europe, had been gutted. Half their officers aristocrats had fled. The rest were distrusted by their men. The citizen soldiers who filled their ranks were brave but untrained, poorly equipped, and leaderless. Early campaigns in the Austrian Netherlands ended in disaster. Skirmishes that turned into panicked retreats, officers murdered by their own troops, generals resigning or defecting, and then came the Brunswick Manifesto. Prussian generals' threat to raise Paris should harm come to the royal family. Paris erupted. On the 10th of August, mobs stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss guards were butchered. The king was deposed. The revolution now devoured its own monarch. But could it withstand the armies of Europe bearing down upon it? As the Prussians advanced, capturing Longwy and Verdun, the path to Paris seemed open. But on the misty morning of September 20th, 1792, at a place called Valmy, the tide turned. In a battle that was more artillery duel than infantry clash, French gunners, veterans of the old royal army, proved their mettle. Amidst the thunder of cannons, the tricolor standard waved defiantly. The troops of the revolution, raw and untested, stood their ground. Kellerman, lifting his hat on the tip of his sword, cried, "Vive la nation!" And a roar went up from thousands of throats. That day, for the first time, the citizen army held the line. Valmy was not a grand battle in the Napoleonic sense. There were no sweeping cavalry charges, no rivers of blood. Casualties numbered only in the hundreds, but its meaning echoed far beyond the ridges of eastern France. For the first time in modern history, an army composed largely of citizens volunteers, not mercenary shad, stood its ground against the most feared professional soldiers in Europe. And they had won, not by divine right or royal banner, but by will, belief, and artillery. The next day, emboldened by this improbable success, France crossed a point of no return. The National Convention, meeting in Paris, declared the monarchy abolished. The French Republic was born. It was not a birth of peace and joy, but of urgency, blood, and thunder. There would be no retreat, no turning back. Across France, church bells told the news. Monarchies watched with dread. The world held its breath. Yet even as the tricolor flag rose in triumph, the revolution began to consume itself. The revolution had been born in the salons of Paris, midwifed by philosophers and lawyers, but now, with war raging and enemies at the gate, it became a revolution of survival, of suspicion, of extremes. Within the National Convention, two powerful factions emerged. On one side were the Girondins moderates, who had once championed the war. They believed in liberty, but also in restraint. They favored spreading revolutionary ideals abroad, but feared the mobs at home. Opposing them were the Montagnards, or the mountain radicals aligned with the Jacobin Club, led by men like Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat. They distrusted the nobility, the clergy, and even the Girondins. They called for swift justice, for virtue through terror. The fall of the monarchy was not enough for the mountain. The king himself had to die. In December 1792, King Louis now, citizen Louis Capitois, brought to trial. The charges were grave: conspiring against the people, colluding with foreign powers, betraying the nation. The evidence was damning, especially letters and secret documents discovered in a hidden iron safe at the Tuileries. The trial electrified France. Could a nation founded on liberty fairly judge the man who had once ruled it absolutely? Robespierre offered no doubt. Louis must die so that the Republic may live. On January 21st, 1793, the blade fell. Louis XVI was dead. But with his blood, the revolution crossed into new territorial place where violence would not be the exception, but the logic of politics itself. And the world was watching. Across Europe, monarchies reeled in horror. A king executed by his own people? It was an affront to the divine order, a threat to every crown. The first coalition, originally a wary alliance between Austria and Prussia, expanded rapidly. Britain, Spain, the Dutch Republic. Naples all joined in what they now saw as a war, not merely against France, but against an idea. The revolution responded in kind. It was no longer a defensive war. Now, it was total. The convention called for levée and massive mass conscription of every able-bodied Frenchman. This was unprecedented. For the first time, war became not just the concern of kings and generals, but of an entire people. In the words of French revolutionary Lazare Carnot, from this moment forward, every Frenchman is a soldier, and every soldier fights for liberty. This citizen army would number in the hundreds of thousands. Young men from farms, villages, and cities, many with no military experience, marched off to face the professional armies of Europe. And behind them, in Paris, the machinery of radicalism was spinning faster and faster. The war abroad gave the radicals cover to settle scores at home. In the name of the Republic, Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety seized near total control. Their aim to purge France of enemies within: nobles, priests, royalists, moderate 7 revolutionaries not radical enough were all fair game. A single accusation could mean arrest. A suspicious word might lead to death. Trials became brief formalities. Execution became routine. The guillotine, once a symbol of justice, became a symbol of fear. It operated daily at the Place de la Révolution, severing heads with brutal efficiency. In the span of less than a year, over 16,000 people would be officially executed. Many more died in prison or without trial. Among the victims, Queen Marie Antoinette, revolutionary leaders like Danton and Desmoulins, and thousands of ordinary citizens. Robespierre, the incorruptible, believed terror was necessary to preserve virtue. Terror, it declared, is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is an emanation of virtue. But terror, once unleashed, cannot be so easily restrained. By mid-1794, Robespierre stood alone atop a mountain of corpses. His enemies were dead. His allies were gone. Even his speeches began to alarm his supporters. Filled with veiled threats and cryptic accusations, one by one, those who had once cheered him began to fear him. On the 9th of Thermidor, July 27th, 1794, Robespierre was arrested by his own colleagues. The next day, the blade he had worshipped found his own neck. The terror was over. The revolution had devoured its children. With the death of Robespierre, France did not find peace. It found exhaustion. The Thermidorian reaction brought an end to mass executions, but it also ushered in cynicism and instability. The revolution's radical phase had burned bright and fast and left behind a vacuum. The new government, known as the Directory, was established in 1795. A five-man executive with a bicameral legislature and no clear vision. It was the revolution's attempt to escape both monarchy and mob rule, and it failed at both. The Directory was weak, plagued by corruption, and despised from all directions. Royalists conspired to restore the Bourbon monarchy. Jacobins plotted to revive the revolution's radical fervor. Inflation soared, food riots returned, and war, always war, continued to devour France's resources. The one source of stability, of pride, was the army, and one man, in particular, was beginning to rise above the rest. Napoleon Bonaparte was just 26 when he was handed command of the Army of Italy in 1796. His appointment was political. He had the backing of key revolutionaries, and few others wanted the job. What followed stunned all of Europe. In a whirlwind campaign, Bonaparte crushed Austria's Italian allies, marched into Milan, and forced Austria to the peace table. He didn't just defeat armies, he redrew maps. More importantly, he did what the Directory could not. He gave France victory, glory, and spoils. Napoleon became a symbol not of terror or ideology, but of action, decisiveness, destiny, and he knew it. In 1798, he launched an ambitious expedition to Egypt, hoping to threaten British power and emulate Alexander the Great. Though the campaign was strategically flawed, his victories at the Battle of the Pyramids and his flirtation with Eastern mystique only added to his myth. But France, back home, was unraveling. The Directory was seen as impotent. The revolution's promises liberty, equality, fraternity now seemed like faded slogans. France was ready for order, and Napoleon was ready to provide it. In November 1799, during what became known as the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon returned from Egypt and overthrew the Directory. There was no great battle, no mass uprising, just a swift, theatrical power grab. With the support of key political and military allies, Napoleon dissolved the legislature and declared a new government, the consulate. He became first consul, effectively the ruler of France. The revolution, in its pure form, was over. The republic still existed on paper, but power now flowed from a single man, and yet, for many in France, it was a relief. The terror was gone. The chaos was over. Napoleon promised stability, meritocracy, modernization, all cloaked in the language of the revolution. He retained the symbols, the tricolor, the legal reforms, the secular state, but the spirit had changed, where once the revolution had declared no more kings, now crowds chanted Vive Napoleon. The French Revolution began as a rebellion against monarchy and ended with the rise of an emperor. Its legacy is one of paradox. It birthed modern democracy, inspiring countless revolutions, reforms, and constitutions around the globe. It pioneered the idea of citizenship, of inalienable rights, of secular governance. It destroyed the feudal order that had gripped Europe for 1,000 years. And yet, it also unleashed mass violence, ideological purges, war, and dictatorship. The revolution proved that ideas are powerful but unstable. It raised enduring questions. Can liberty survive when faced with chaos? Can equality exist without coercion? Can revolution ever restrain itself? These are not questions confined to history. They remain relevant, painfully so, in every age where people demand justice, topple power, and try to build something new. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, placing the laurel wreath on his own head. From the storming of the Bastille to the coronation at Notre Dame, just 15 years had passed. A republic had risen and fallen. A king had been beheaded and replaced by another ruler, this one born not of divine, right, but of ambition, charisma, and war. The revolution did not end in a republic, but it did change the world. And though its original flame may have flickered, its embers still glow in the pages of constitutions, in the protests of the oppressed, in the cries of those who still dare to declare, "We are the people." What followed in the age of Napoleon would take these ideals across all of Europe in cannon fire and legal codes alike. But that is another story.